In this portion of Frederick Law Olmsted's journey through Virginia in 1852, he's searching for a prominent slave owner named Mr. W. But in his search, he gets lost and he interacts with various Negroes and slave masters. And one master in particular gives Olmsted the inside scoop on white laborers and how they are and are not used on his farm. And also how the poor whites apparently have been influencing the behavior of the Negroes, right? So, pay attention as we delve into these scenes by opening up the PDF version of the book titled A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States by Frederick Law Olmsted. And we're going to turn to page 61, where he writes this.
How far is it all, sir?
Olmsted at this point was traveling through the Virginia country when he ran into a 50-acre farm occupied by a white Southerner that was chewing tobacco. And since cars weren't around at this time, he rented a horse from the man so he can go and find Mr. W's house. And upon exiting the residence, he asked him how far Mr. W's house was, and this was his reply.
I reckon it's about 2 hours' ride when the roads are good to the sawmill. Mr. W's gate is only a mile or so beyond that, and then you've got another mile or better after you get to the gate. But you'll see some quarters. The belong to Mr. W, and I reckon there'll be some of 'em round, and they'll show you just where to go.
After reading over my memorandum and finding it correct, and agreeing with him that I should pay $2 a day for the mare, we walked out and found her saddled and waiting for me.
So afterwards, Olmsted gets on the horse and takes off. He mentions in his account that he built a bond with the horse and he enjoyed her company. Now, as they journey through the sparse country land, Olmsted gets a bit lost and he finds himself at the entrance of another farm, right, where he runs into a slave. And this is the account and what happened.
We then arrived at a grove of tall oak trees, in the midst of which ran a brook, giving motion to a small grist mill. Back of the mill were 2 log cabins, and near these a number of Negroes, in holiday clothes, were standing in groups among the trees. When we stopped, one of them came towards us. He wore a battered old hat of the cylindrical fashion, stiffly starched shirt collar, cutting his ears, a red cravat, and an old black dress coat, threadbare and a little ragged, but adorned with new brass buttons. He knew Mr. Thomas W. Certainly he did, and he reckoned I had come about 4 miles, he did not know but it might be 8 if I thought so, off the road I had been directed to follow. But that was of no consequence because he could show me where to go by a straight road, a cross-cut, from here, that would make it just as quick for me as if I had gone the way I had intended. How far is it from here? I asked.
Oh, it ain't far, sir.
How far do you think?
Well, massa, I spec,
looking at my horse.
I spec, massa, if you goes the way, sir, that I shows you, sir, I reckon it'll take you.
How far is it? How many miles?
How many miles, sir? Ha, massa, I don't exactly reckon I can tell you. Not sizely, sir. How many miles it is? Not exactly sizely, sir.
How is that? You don't what?
I don't exactly reckon I can give you the direction exercise about the miles, sir.
Oh, but how many miles do you think it is? Is it 2 miles?
Yes, sir. As the roads is now, I think it is just about 2 miles. They's long ones, though, I reckon.
Long ones? You think it's more than 2 miles, don't you then?
Yes, sir. I reckon it's 4 or 5 miles.
4 or 5? 4 or 5 long ones or short ones, do you mean?
I don't exactly know, sir. Whether they is short ones or long ones, sir. But I reckon you find 'em middling long. I expect you'll be about 2 hours before you be done going all the way to Mass W's.
He walked on with us a few rods upon a narrow path until we came to a crossing of the stream. Pointing to where it continued on the other side, he assured me that it went right straight to Mr. W's plantation.
You just keep the straight road, master,
he repeated several times.
And it'll take you right there, sir.
He had been grinning and bowing and constantly touching his hat or holding it in his hand during our conversation, which I understood to mean that he would thank me for a dime. I gave it to him, upon which he repeated his contortions and his form of direction.
Keep the straight road.
I rode through the brook, and he called out again.
You keep that road right straight and it'll take you right straight there.
I rode up the hank and entered the oak wood, and still again heard him enjoining me to
keep that road right straight.
Now, a quick side note. Imagine if the descendants of these people still spoke like this today. I mean, there's some people who still do have a speech pattern that somewhat resembles this, but most do not, right? This here is the original and authentic Negro and Black person in America. And the point here is that this was not a permanent phase, but a transitional phase, a cocoon phase for the consciousness to later emerge into something new after the unknowable concluded the construction of the consciousness, right? What I'm talking about here is part of the metaphysical interpretation of the slavery circumstance, right? Understand. Now, back to Olmsted's journey. After Olmsted left, he got lost again. Now, remember, he's on a journey to find the prominent planter, Mr. W. But he keeps finding himself in these random places. And the next place that he finds himself at is on a farm owned by a man he called Mr. Newman. That wasn't his name, but he called him in his account Mr. Newman. And he had a few young and old Negro slaves inside of his house that did the cooking and the cleaning and any of the other miscellaneous tasks that the Newman family didn't care to do. Now, after a short while, Mr. Newman invited Olmsted into his house to have supper with his wife and kids. And Olmsted certainly noted how pretty his wife was. So we do have to keep an eye out on Olmsted when it comes to the women. But after supper, Olmsted and Mr. Newman retreated to a separate room. And their conversation followed its way into the topic of slavery. And this right here is where it gets good. Here we go.
I learned that there were no white laboring men here who hired themselves out by the month. The poor white people that had to labor for their living never would work steadily at any employment. They mostly followed boating, hiring as hands on the bateaus that navigate the small streams and canals, but never for a longer term at once than a single trip of a boat, whether that might be long or short. At the end of the trip, they were paid by the day. Their wages were from 50 cents to $1, varying with the demand and individual capacities. They hardly ever worked on farms except in harvest, when they usually received $1 a day, sometimes more. In harvest time, most of the rural mechanics closed their shops and hired out to the farmers at $1 a day, which would indicate that their ordinary earnings are considerably less than this. At other than harvest time, the poor white people, who had no trade, would sometimes work for the farmers by the job, not often at any regular agricultural labor, but at getting rails or shingles, or clearing land,
or digging ditches like Mr. C hired them to do on his DC farm in Commentary 232.
He did not know that they were particular about working with Negroes,
meaning Mr. Newman was unsure if the white laborers had a problem working alongside black people.
But no white man would ever do certain kinds of work, such as taking care of cattle or getting water or wood to be used in the house.
But he knew for sure that they had a problem doing that type of work. Pay attention.
And if you should ask a white man you had hired to do such things, he would get mad and tell you he wasn't a nigger.
He would tell you that type of work is for the blacks. The N-word was synonymous with Negro, and they both meant black. It didn't mean an ignorant black person like some of us have been told growing up. The N-word is an English variant of Negro. Negro is really the Spanish word negro, but it's just pronounced with a somewhat lazy American accent, right? Negro. So the N-word is the Americanized version of this word, but at the root, they all simply mean black. Now, what distinguishes the N-word from the others was its frequent use with the demeaning intention. Now, I mean, all of them are demeaning from my perspective, but the N-word was used with a more purposely demeaning intention, whereas black and Negro had become over time just the normal name to call people after centuries of use, right? But to me, like I said, they're all demeaning, right? As there were terms used on subordinate people by the conquerors, right? And they have negative meanings associated with them, right? Wild meanings that are attached to them as well. And they're their incorrect color, right? So they're all demeaning to me. Now, back to the white laborers. If they were asked to take care of cattle or get water or wood, they would get mad and tell you that they weren't an N-word, right? Let's get some more.
Poor white girls never hired out to do servants' work, but they would come and help another white woman about her sewing or quilting, and take wages for it. But these girls were not very respectable generally, and it was not agreeable to have them in your house, though there were some very respectable ladies that would go out to sew.
And it most likely wasn't due to the fact that they didn't have a lot of money. It was likely due to them having a certain mentality that made it not agreeable to have them in their homes. They probably stole a lot of things. They probably talked in an inappropriate manner while they were in people's homes. And they probably had an eye on other people's husbands, right? As it was said in the old Southern culture that they were very promiscuous. Now let's keep reading.
Farmers depended almost entirely upon their Negroes. It was only when they were hard pushed by their crops that they got white hands to help them any. Negroes had commanded such high wages lately to work on railroads and in tobacco factories that farmers were tempted to hire out too many of their people and to undertake to do too much work with those they retained, and thus they were often driven to employ white men and to give them very high wages by the day, when they found themselves getting much behindhand with their crops. He had been driven very hard in this way this last season. He had been so unfortunate as to lose one of his best women, who died in childbed just before harvest. The loss of the woman and her child, for the child had died also, just at that time, came very hard upon him. He would not have taken $1,000 of any man's money for them. He had had to hire white men to help him, but they were poor sticks and would be half the time drunk, and you never know what to depend upon with them.
Uh-oh, lots of whiskey and wine.
One fellow that he had hired, who had agreed to work for him all through harvest, got him to pay him some wages in advance. He said it was to buy him some clothes with so he could go to meeting Sunday at the courthouse, and went off the next day right in the middle of harvest, and he never had seen him since. He had heard of him, he was on a boat, but he didn't reckon he should ever get his money again.
He took off on his behind, and some years ago I had a similar situation happen to me while living out here in the country in the South. I hired some of the whites from the backwoods to do some work. They did part of it, and then they gave me some excuse, which I don't remember what it was, but I paid them a little bit more for the work that I expected them to complete. Then they took off on me, right? And I didn't hear from them afterwards, and they didn't finish the rest of the work. Then I said, uh-oh, they got me, right? They got me. And I learned my lesson quickly, right? And I said, never again, right? Never again. So I can relate to what Mr. Newman is talking about here. Here we go.
Of course, he did not see how white laborers were ever going to come into competition with Negroes here at all. You never could depend on white men, and you couldn't drive them any. They wouldn't stand it.
Drive means you couldn't force them or treat them harshly to do work like they could do to the slaves. The whites weren't going for that, right? Remember, they had the white consciousness, which prioritized being white over class, right? So even if it was a poor white, he still saw himself on eye level with the well-off white, right? So he for sure wasn't going to be able to drive him. Now watch this.
Slaves were the only reliable laborers. You could command them and make them do what was right.
The slaves were already trained to be subordinate for over 200 years at this time in America. They were already accustomed to fulfilling the role of listening and obeying the master, much easier than any of the whites, right? Most of the whites didn't have that consciousness, character, and culture within themselves like most of the blacks were forced to develop, right? That's why he said what he said. Now listen to this.
From the manner in which he always talked of the white laboring people, it was evident that, although he placed them in some sort on an equality with himself, and that in his intercourse with them he wouldn't think of asserting for himself any superior dignity, or even feel himself to be patronizing them in not doing so, yet he, all the time, recognized them as a distinct and a rather despicable class, and wanted to have as little to do with them as he conveniently could. I have been once or twice told that the poor white people, meaning those, I suppose, who bring nothing to market to exchange for money but their labor, although they may own a cabin and a little furniture, and cultivate land enough to supply themselves with maize bread, are worse off in almost all respects than the slaves.
It's getting spicy. Here we go.
They are said to be extremely ignorant and immoral, as well as indolent and unambitious.
let's stop right here and deal with this a bit further. Let's go over here and grab the golden nugget by Dr. Grady McWhiney called The Cracker Culture, right? So we can hear some more about this ignorance and immorality in the Old South. Now let's turn to page 171, where he writes this.
A New Yorker called Southerners
the greatest criminals of the age.
These men of the brave South who threatened with bowie knives and pistols and bludgeons the Northern preachers who went among them to teach righteousness.
Let us pray for the day when honest Yankee wine and oil shall take the place of Southern barbarous whiskey and hog fat,
wrote another Northerner, who exclaimed that any New Yorker would
rather own 10 acres on the Hudson River than 500 on the Mississippi.
Such critical observations were made throughout the South. A Northerner announced that Virginians
are profane and exceeding wicked.
Very vile and violent is what they were reported to be. And Dr. McWhiney argues that this consciousness and culture was brought over to the South from their Celtic ancestors. And he provides parallel reports demonstrating the similarities between the two. Now let's see what he says about the Southern ignorance. Here we go.
Southerners generally cared little for reading. The Southern woman described by a traveler as
sitting with a pipe in her mouth, doing no work and reading no books,
would doubtless have agreed with the Southern man who, when asked by a Yankee if he liked to read, replied,
"No, it's damn tiresome."
It has often been said, only partly in jest, that more Southerners wrote books than read them.
You know,
A North Carolinian informed a visitor,
we people do not like books so well, but we like to remember and memorize many things that we do love.
A Virginian told Yankee tourist Jared Sparks that
there will be no such thing as bookmaking in Virginia for a century to come. People here prefer talking to reading, as Mr. Houston said of those in Tennessee.
Another Yankee who was surprised
to find the houses of slaveholders so generally destitute of books.
Believed
there were more books and more men of liberal education in the state of Maine, with her 500,000 inhabitants, than in all the slave states.
This is what was reported on multiple occasions. And as a matter of fact, just about this entire book is filled with reports of firsthand accounts of people who lived during that era. And a lot of them co-signed what Olmsted was told about the Southern whites being ignorant, indolent, and immoral, right? So let's go ahead and put the golden nugget up right now and find out what else Olmsted was told.
They are said to corrupt the Negroes and to encourage them to steal or to work for them at night and on Sundays, and to pay them with liquor and also to constantly associate licentiously with them.
In Commentary 235, you remember there was a slave master who owned 96 slaves. And he said his Negroes were getting too much liberty and picking up bad habits. Here's one of the possibilities of where those bad habits came from, right? Back then, the poor Southern whites were the popular and influential people for promoting this type of behavior, right? Just like the blacks occupy that spot today in America. The Southern cracker culture was said to be highly contagious and influential, right? And it was the dominant culture in the South. That's why they were reported to corrupt the Negroes, encourage them to steal, work for them at night, pay them in liquor, and associate licentiously with them, or to dabble in the bedroom, or probably somewhere out there in the woods somewhere at this time. Now let's finish up.
They seem, nevertheless, more than any other portion of the community to hate and despise the Negroes.
They were some of the biggest champions of white supremacy because that's what allowed them to get high. They didn't have a lot of material wealth and they didn't own many slaves in most instances. But the thing that could always make them feel better about themselves is taking out all their frustration on who their ancestors named the Negro, right? So it made sense that they hated and despised them. Now, we still have to remember that Olmsted is on his journey to find Mr. W., who was a prominent slave owner in that area. On the next commentary, he's going to finally arrive on the plantation, and he's going to learn some very interesting things from him. So you're going to want to definitely stay tuned in for that. Now, for right now, what I want to do is thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.